Hello, my name is Elizabeth Bice, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Council, Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that we are hosting this event on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled The Relevance of the French Revolution and the Paris Commune of 1871, with Cliff Connor, New York-based author of Jean-Paul Marat, Tribune of the French Revolution, and discussant Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary, Socialist Action Canada, and I will be hosting the show. Comrade Cliff Connors will give a talk for about 35 minutes, followed by Comrade Barry Weisletter, who will speak for about 10 minutes. Then we will take a few questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the website directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly onto the chat column. Please direct your question to a specific person if you wish, or to both. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear on this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up at our website, www.socialistaction.ca, and by calling 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And as I've told you before, this is easy to remember. 1917 was the year of the Russian Revolution. So let's begin. Cliff Connor is an historian of science, author, and former member of the School for Professional Studies of the City University of New York Graduate Center. He was born in 1941 in New Jersey. Connor grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. For decades, Cliff was a prominent member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He is the author of Jean-Paul Marat, Tribune of the French Revolution, as well as A People's History of Science. His latest book is The Tragedy of American Science, From Truman to Trump. Welcome, Cliff.
Thanks for the introduction, Elizabeth, and thanks to Socialist Action Canada for inviting me to speak tonight. There's an ancient Chinese curse that I'm sure most of you have heard before. May you live in interesting times. It would seem that our own times are about to get more interesting. I'm alluding to what's going on in the United States right now, but to paraphrase Robin Williams, to be a Canadian these days is more than ever like living upstairs from a meth lab. So we're in this together, and we don't know what the interesting times ahead are going to bring us. Will they be a blessing or a curse, or maybe both? Regardless of the long-range outcome, it could be that things will get worse before they get better. Meanwhile, we can try to prepare ourselves for the storm, and one way to do that is to consult history and try to see what we can learn from earlier examples of interesting times. The most interesting of historical times are indicated by specific four-digit numbers that are deeply etched in our collective memories. 1492, 1776, 1789, 1917, 1949, and 1959. All but the first of these denote powerful social revolutions that turned the world upside down. The one I'm going to be talking about is 1789, which is the year that's still celebrated in France and around the world to mark the anniversary of a mighty social revolution that transformed not only France, but all of Europe and eventually the world. But I'll begin by adding another four-digit number to the mix, 1793. The history of the French Revolution has for 200 years been a matter of controversy between conservative historians who try to downplay its significance and progressive historians who recognize it as among the most transformative of all historical events. The conservative historian Francois Furet has correctly pointed out that both participants in and interpreters of the French Revolution can be divided into two groups, 89ers versus 93ers. The 89ers are the revolutionaries of 1789, like Mirabeau and Lafayette, and those who identify with them. Like Furet himself, they believe the revolution would have been much better if it had been more moderate, if it had been satisfied with what had been accomplished in 1789 and stopped right there. The 93ers, on the other hand, are the radical Jacobins and their later sympathizers who believed that turning the world upside down in 1793 was absolutely necessary to consolidate the revolution's achievements. I count myself as a 93er, and I suspect that many of you do as well. The agitator haranguing the crowd in that graphic was Jean-Paul Marat. The conservative historians, like Francois Furet, dismiss Marat as an accidental figure on the stage of history, an ultra-radical demagogue who gained immense notoriety but should not be counted among the authentic leaders of the revolution. I strongly disagree with that assessment, and that's why I wrote a biography of Marat, to argue that, to the contrary, Marat was a highly effective leader of the French Revolution who earned his influence through the consistency and principled nature of his leadership. I'm not here to plug my own book, but I will say that if you want a concise account of the French Revolution, written from the perspective of a 93er historian, you will find it in that book. But if you want to investigate the subject in more depth, I recommend the works of Georges Lefebvre, and one of his books in particular, The Coming of the French Revolution. Georges Lefebvre, in that book, described how the process unfolded as a succession of 4 overlapping revolutionary waves crashing against the monarchy. The aristocracy initiated the turmoil, followed by the bourgeoisie, then the peasants, and then the urban poor, the sans-culottes. Lefebvre's masterful weaving together of the separate strands is known as the Lefebvre synthesis. It became the standard account of the history of the French Revolution for many years, the orthodox version, if you will, until the 1950s, when the Cold War encouraged conservative historians like Alfred Cobbin in England, and later Francois Furet in France, to challenge Lefebvre's synthesis. But enough about the historians. Let's get back to the revolution itself. The first wave was the so-called aristocratic rebellion. In the 1770s, when the American colonists rose up in arms against British rule, the French monarchy saw an opportunity to strike a blow against its #1 rival. So it gave material aid to the American revolutionaries. The expenses of that war stretched the royal government's finances to the breaking point. The monarchy was so deeply in debt that 50% of its budget was going for interest on its loans. Louis XVI's advisors began desperately seeking new sources of revenue. The peasants were already so heavily taxed that squeezing them harder could only produce minimal returns. The Crown's frantic search for new financial resources forced it to turn to the aristocracy, which had traditionally enjoyed extensive exemption from taxation. In spite of their privileged social position, the noble landowners had long been excluded from a direct political role in governing France. The threat to their economic interest prompted them to begin agitating for political rights as a means of defense. And that was what touched off the aristocratic rebellion. The aristocrats succeeded in shaking the monarchy, but in doing so, it opened the door for other social layers to also begin raising demands. And thereby hangs the tale of the French Revolution. The greatest irony of 1789 is that the social class that began the revolution was the one that was ultimately destroyed by it. So that was the story of the aristocratic rebellion. Next, it was the bourgeoisie's turn. Now, who were the bourgeoisie? They were commoners, which is to say that they weren't aristocratic landowners. But for the most part, they weren't economically deprived. They weren't poor. The basic division of social classes in those times went like this. Peasants on the bottom, aristocrats on top, and everybody else in the middle. But that middle class was far from uniform. Most of it consisted of very poor city dwellers, artisans, tradespeople, wage workers, and the like. But a small minority of the middle class was economically much better off. Big business owners and professional people, such as doctors, lawyers, professors, journalists, intellectuals, and so forth. And that was the bourgeoisie. The nobility's drive for political rights led to the demand for reconvening the Estates General, a medieval parliamentary body that had last met in 1614, more than a century and a half earlier. And the bourgeoisie took up that fight and became its primary leaders. The Estates General was not at all a democratic institution, since the three estates were to have equal weight in the assembly, but represented vastly unequal numbers of constituents. In the population as a whole, the first estate, the clergy, numbered about 100,000. The second estate, the nobility, numbered about 400,000. And the third estate, that means everybody else, numbered about 25 million. So here's how the Estates General made its decisions. Each of the three estates had one vote. Since the clergy could be counted upon to vote with the nobles, the nobility could always outvote the third estate 2-1. Nonetheless, because the nobles' demand for an Estates General was seen as a challenge to the oppressive monarchy, it gathered broad support from all classes throughout the entire population. Louis XVI's government, pushed to the wall by the fiscal crisis, was forced to give in. The Estates General is set to be held at the beginning of May 1789. The leaders of the Third Estate, however, had a different kind of Estates General in mind, one that would more clearly reflect the fact that they represented 97% of the population. Now you see the problem here. The representatives of 97% of the people of France were being outvoted 2-1 every time. So when the nobles, with the king's backing, refused to consider the demand for a more democratic arrangement, the representatives of the Third Estate walked out and held their own meeting. And on June 17th, they declared themselves the National Assembly. France then had a new potential force of governmental power in competition with the existing royal government. Although the leaders of the Third Estate, and now of the National Assembly, were almost uniformly bourgeois, they enjoyed very wide popular support. Meanwhile, the vast majority of people who were neither noble nor bourgeois were getting angrier and more impatient. In the countryside, the peasants had already embarked upon their own revolution. During July and August, they rose up against their aristocratic landlords all over the country. Oppressed for centuries by feudal dues, taxes, mandatory tithes to the church, and forced labor, they took advantage of the weakness of the royal regime to redress their own grievances. Manor houses were sacked and burned, and some of the landlords were killed or chased away. But most importantly, the peasant revolts, coming right at harvest time, were able to forcibly block the collection of dues, tithes, and taxes. As the peasants set their fires, their main targets were the archives, where records and documents defining their debts and obligations were kept. So that was the beginning of the peasant uprising, which was to continue, often in open rebellion, to the point of civil war, from 1789 until their complete victory in 1793. We'll return to that, but first let's consider the fourth, and in many ways the most decisive of the four waves of rebellion, which burst onto the stage of history on July 12th, 1789. That was the day the masses of the urban poor, the sans-culottes, took to the streets of Paris and rose up in open revolt. Angry crowds began arming themselves by looting gunsmith shops. Revolutionary-minded bourgeois political leaders attempted to bring order to the rebellion by organizing a citizens' militia, the National Guard. The royal troops withdrew to their barracks. Their ranks had been strongly affected by the spread of revolutionary ideas. After 2 days, on the 14th of July, the mass action in the streets came to a climax with the famous assault on the Bastille. The old prison had been used as an armory, and the crowd proceeded to liberate its guns and ammunitions. The old municipal administration was swept aside, and a new city government, the Paris Commune, was formed. Louis XVI was forced to recognize the triumph of the revolution by symbolically accepting the tricolor cockade to the cheers of the Parisian masses. That's the cockade on his hat. The insurrection had legitimized the rule of the National Assembly and initiated a period of de facto constitutional monarchy. While Paris led the way, it was by no means the only urban revolution. As news of the July 14th uprising spread, insurrections occurred in cities throughout France and established the rule of revolutionary committees everywhere. Before we move on, let me give you 4 dates to keep in mind, the 4 most critical dates in the unfolding of the revolution. The first was the famous Bastille Day, still celebrated every year on the 14th of July. That was number 1 in a series of powerful urban insurrections that periodically drove the revolution forward. There were many more than I'm indicating here, but the most important were on August 10th, 1792, and May 31st, 1793. The first of those 3, Bastille Day, transformed France from an absolutist monarchy into a constitutional monarchy. The second, August 10th, 1792, transformed France from a monarchy into a republic. And the third, May 31st, 1793, brought the radical Jacobins to the fore, resulting in what has been called the Jacobin Republic. The Jacobin Republic itself didn't last long, but what it accomplished did. What Robespierre, Marat, and the other 93ers did at that time consolidated the gains the revolution had made up to that point. That's how 93er historians like Georges Lefebvre and myself understand the dynamics of the French Revolution. I'll say more about that later, but first I'll recall your attention to the last of those 4 crucial dates. As I said, the radical Jacobin Republic didn't last long. It fell on that 4th date, July 24th, 1794, when a coup d'etat overthrew Robespierre's government, executed him, and a group of moderate politicians took over the government. That can be considered the day the French Revolution came to an end. This counter-revolution is known in the history books as the Thermidorian reaction. And because the revolution had established a new calendar, and the month in which the overthrow of the Jacobin Republic occurred was named Thermidor, that's why they called the counter-revolution the Thermidorian reaction. After Thermidor, the moderates put a stop to the Jacobins' efforts to create a more egalitarian society, but they were unable to roll back the primary accomplishments of the revolution. Now let's go back to 1789 and see what the peasants were doing. In July 1789, as we've seen, the countryside was aflame with burning manor houses. But although the landowners had been dealt a heavy blow, they weren't about to simply abandon their privileged social position. The weakened royal government wasn't able to militarily suppress the peasant rebellion, so the landowners turned to the National Assembly, which, as we've seen, was then under the control of the revolutionary bourgeoisie, the 89ers. On August 4th, less than a month after Bastille Day, a very peculiar session of the National Assembly took place. Aristocratic landowners stood up, one after the other, to voluntarily renounce their privileges. This was not a case of belated generosity or guilty consciences, as it might have appeared on the surface. For one thing, the landowners were renouncing rights and privileges that had already come under sharp attack by the peasants' revolt. The aristocrats were trying to put the best face possible on a fait accompli. More importantly, the aristocrats were hoping by their action to win compensation for the privileges that they were giving up. And indeed, the National Assembly backed their requests. The peasants would be expected to pay for their emancipation. Feudal dues were to be legally done away with, but only in exchange for large cash payments. Since hardly any peasants were able to pay such amounts, they were faced with being perpetually in debt to their former landlords. Instead of feudal dues, they would instead be making payments on their loans. That arrangement would have replaced the bonds of feudal law with debt bondage. The peasants would still have been tied to the land for a long, long time, as in Russia following the 1861 legal emancipation of the serfs. The peasants, understandably, were not at all satisfied with this deal, so they remained in struggle. Their struggle continued until their complete victory in 1793, when the Jacobin Republic declared the peasants' redemptive debts null and void. I'll again say more about that later. But it's in this episode, in this session of the National Assembly, that the differences between the 89ers and the 93ers stand out most sharply. The 89ers were at that time in control of the National Assembly, and they sided with the aristocrats against the peasants. They didn't want the revolution to go any further, but they weren't able to hold it back. As the revolution continued to radicalize, the leaders of 1789 fell by the wayside. Both Mirabeau and Lafayette would explicitly betray the revolution. Mirabeau was later found to have actually been on the king's payroll while he was in the leadership of the National Assembly. In 1792, Lafayette would try to rally his troops to march on Paris and overthrow the revolutionary government, but his troops refused to follow him and he was forced to flee the country. Again, these four dates depict the deepening radicalization of the revolution from 1789 through 1793 until its defeat in 1794. The second date on the list, August 10th, 1792, more than 3 years after the original Bastille Day, was when the most powerful insurrection up to that point took place. The Sans-Culottes emerged as a more independent political force, seeking ever more radical leadership. That's when Lafayette attempted to march on Paris to restore bourgeois order. But as I said, his troops deserted him, and he fled to join the Austrian enemy. The insurrection of August 10th overthrew the monarchy, and the Republic was proclaimed the following month. A national convention was elected on the basis of adult male suffrage, making the Republic far more democratic and popular than the ousted constitutional monarchy. Meanwhile, France had been at war since April 1792 against a coalition of European powers determined to crush the revolution. At that point, the revolution appeared to be in grave danger of military defeat at the hands of the professionally led Prussian and Austrian troops. The French army had been weakened because their traditional officer corps hated the revolution and had already gone over to the enemy. When the revolutionaries took over the royal palace, they discovered a big box of Louis XVI's correspondence that proved what had long been suspected. The king was knee-deep, neck-deep in collaboration with the counter-revolutionary armies invading France. So in 1793, he was tried for treason, condemned to death, and guillotined. The execution of the former king stood as a powerful symbol of the irreversibility of the revolution. It threw down the gauntlet to the counter-revolutionary forces inside France and throughout Europe. In the following months, England, Holland, and Spain joined the war coalition against France, and a major counter-revolutionary revolt erupted in the Vendée in western France. With the revolution under siege from all sides, the class struggle rapidly intensified. The mood of the Parisian sans-culottes was white-hot with revolutionary fervor. They began to perceive the moderate Republican leaders, the Girondin faction, as too conciliatory toward the revolution's enemies. As a result, the radical Jacobin faction gained an influence. And that's where the third date on the list comes in, May 31st, 1793, the beginning of a three-day insurrection. The climax of the Great French Revolution was at hand. The Girondins were ousted from power and replaced by the Jacobins, led by Robespierre, Marat, Danton, and others. The radical Jacobin government, in alliance with the rebellious peasants and the sans-culottes, dealt the final mortal blows to the aristocracy of the class. Moralizing conservative historians have labored long and hard to discredit the French Revolution by portraying Robespierre and his colleagues as bloodthirsty paranoids who used the guillotine to intimidate the masses and eliminate their factional opponents. But in fact, the danger to the revolution was no paranoid fantasies. Its external and internal enemies were numerous and powerful. The Jacobins' harsh measures, known to history as the Terror, were necessary to defeat the revolution. The extreme need for unity and security, however, led to abuses of power with terrible consequences for the Jacobins themselves. The dangers of war and counter-revolution pressed the Jacobin Republic to bring the turbulent mass movement under strict control. In doing so, it suppressed the revolutionary energy of its own political base and sowed the seeds of its own downfall. The execution of dissident revolutionaries like Danton, Hébert, and Desmoulins was particularly disoriented and demoralizing. By the middle of 1794, the military tide had turned, and the threat from invading armies had eased considerably. With the primary justification for the terror disappearing, a moderate faction in the convention was able to isolate and defeat Robespierre and send him and his supporters to the guillotine. Revolutionary organizations called another Parisian insurrection in defense of the Jacobin leaders, but this time the demoralized Parisian masses failed to respond, and that's when the Thermidorian reaction put the French Revolution in the deep freeze. But the fall of Robespierre and the Jacobin Republic didn't cause the fundamental gains of the revolution that had been achieved up to that point to be rolled back. So let's talk about that. What were those gains? What exactly was it that the Great French Revolution had accomplished? The accomplishments are of two kinds. The first can be summed up by saying that the French Revolution was a democratic revolution. The second can be summed up by saying that the French Revolution was a capitalist revolution. Now keep in mind that we're talking about 230 years ago. This was not capitalism as it exists today. Capitalism at that time was a highly progressive economic system compared to what it was replacing. So first, let's talk about the democratic side of the revolution's accomplishment, and then we'll talk about the economic and social transformation that it brought about. The old regime had been founded on the principle of natural inequality, that some people were by birth superior to others, and thereby entitled to special privileges. The revolution produced a social order based on the opposite premise of which was human equality. From this premise were derived the rights to equality before the law, representative government, and guarantees of civil liberties. After the fall of the Bastille, the democratic aspects of the French Revolution began to manifest themselves in Paris very directly. The monarchy's repressive apparatus ceased to function, and Parisians began to exercise long-denied democratic rights of free assembly and free expression. These newfound liberties were codified by the National Assembly in its declarations of the rights of man and the citizens. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom from arbitrary arrest, and religious freedom became the law of the land. But in addition to these democratic rights, the Declaration also affirmed the inviolability and sacredness of property rights, underlining the capitalist character of the revolution. Its aim was to promote personal liberty and civil equality, but not social equality. And that leads us into the capitalist aspect of the French Revolution. The revolution succeeded in ridding France of a social class whose right to rule was based on aristocratic birth and traditional privilege. The new ruling class based its claim to social dominance on wealth, and wealth alone. The essential prerequisite for the development of a capitalist economy is the existence of a free labor force, a pool of working people who own no property. As long as the vast majority of the population was unable to leave the land, no such labor force could exist in France, and capitalist development was severely hampered. You will recall that the 89ers, the bourgeois revolutionaries of 1789, ended feudalism as a legal system, but proposed that the peasants compensate the nobles by paying a heavy price for their emancipation. Such an arrangement would have kept the peasants tied to the land for a long, long time. That's why the Jacobin Republic's 1793 decree canceling all of the peasants' obligations without compensation was the decisive act of the capitalist revolution. That was the point of no return. It put an end to the feudal mode of production once and for all and transformed the peasantry into a potential modern working class. But the system of non-agricultural production was also in dire need of reform. Manufacturing was hamstrung by royal monopolies, internal tariffs, the guild system, and the lack of a uniform system of weights and measures. The internal tariff system formed economic walls separating all of the provinces of France. To sell a commodity more than a few miles from where it was made meant crossing a tariff barrier and paying a fee. It also meant paying exorbitant tolls for transportation on roads and rivers. The farther a manufacturer or merchant tried to extend the market for their products, the more tariffs and tolls they would encounter. In addition to these restrictions on commerce, The guild system directly hampered production by forcing artisans to pay heavy fees for the privilege of plying their trades. Reformers like Jacques Turgot, sorry, waiting for a slide. That's Jacques Turgot, Louis XVI's finance minister. He was a reformer who tried to abolish what he called arbitrary institutions that stifle industry, like the guilds. But all of his reforms failed. It took the dynamite blast of the revolution to dislodge the entrenched interests defending the status quo. By February 1791, the National Assembly had abolished the internal tariffs, eliminated private tolls on roads and rivers, suppressed the guilds, and introduced a uniform system of weights and measures. So that was the capitalist revolution. The peasants were liberated from feudal obligations, and the guilds and the internal tariffs were swept away. Furthermore, the extensive land holdings of the Catholic Church were expropriated, and the very definition of property was profoundly transformed. All of these measures created a relatively free market economic environment that was good for business. In other words, conducive to the development of capitalism. The principal long-term beneficiaries of the revolution were the business class, entrepreneurs, manufacturers, merchants, and bankers. The new society was geared to serving their class interests rather than those of the landed aristocracy. That's what's meant by saying that the French Revolution was first and foremost a capitalist revolution that enabled the capitalist economic system to thrive and develop. And finally, let's talk about how the social revolution spread from France to the rest of the world. Napoleon Bonaparte came on the scene in 1799, but the export of the French Revolution to the rest of Western Europe had already begun several years earlier, when the revolution was at its height. Sister republics were created in Holland, Switzerland, Northern Italy, Naples, and the Papal States by means of revolutionary action led by local Jacobins with the support of the French Revolutionary Army. That's how the social transformation of Western Europe began, and later it would be consolidated and extended by the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon Bonaparte, however, was certainly no democrat. He did away with the republics and converted them into kingdoms, ruled by his brothers, other relatives, and assorted sidekicks. At home, he scrapped the French Republic, crowned himself emperor, and even created a new titled nobility. By naming his brother Jerome as King of Westphalia, his brother Louis as King of Holland, and his brother Joseph as King of Naples and Spain, he intended to create a new royal dynasty to rule Europe long into the future. At the same time, he imposed a unified body of law, the Napoleonic Code on the conquered territories, based on the principle of equality before the law, and that did away with legal aristocratic privilege throughout Western Europe. But most important, he exported the capitalist revolution to those areas he controlled. The essence of the Napoleonic Code was the principle of private property rights, which took the place of the old regime system based on birthright and feudal social relations. In other words, Napoleon Bonaparte's armies reproduced through Western Europe that new social order that was good for business. Bonaparte's rule didn't produce fully developed capitalist economies, but it did liberate peasants and cleared away other obstacles to the future development of capitalism. After Bonaparte's final defeat in 1815, the Bourbon monarchy was reimposed on France, and the Metternich era of reaction descended upon Europe. But for all the symbolic, superficial reversals, the essential achievements of the revolution survived both inside and outside France. Nowhere were freed serfs returned to serfdom. Nowhere were the results of the peasant rebellion undone. However, the problems of poverty and economic inequality remained, and from those times up to today have only gotten worse. Those problems had to be addressed by a different kind of revolution, one that also began to manifest itself in Paris almost a century later in the experience of the Paris Commune of 1871, which Barry is going to be talking about next. I'll close by summoning the spirit of the people's friend, Jean-Paul Marat. WWMD. If he could be here today with us, what would Marat do? What would he think of the state of our planet? Let me get the next graphic of Marat there, if I can.
You have to wrap up, Cliff.
Okay, there it is. What would Marat think of the state of our planet entering the third decade of the 21st century? He could read in the history books that the Great French Revolution, his revolution, is recognized as a watershed event in the making of the modern world. But he would ask us, so what? What good did it do? And we could tell him, it established legal and political equality, which then spread throughout much of Europe and the world. And then he would ask, is that all? Legal and political equality? What about economic and social equality? Well, Jean-Paul, I'm sorry to have to tell you that in that regard, the world is even worse off now than when you were alive. Today, despite 2 centuries of mind-boggling technological progress, a handful of billionaires control most of the Earth's resources, while billions of people remain mired in hunger, disease, oppression, and grinding poverty. Marat would surely be shocked and dismayed to learn that after more than 200 years, his struggle for social revolution had lost none of its relevance and urgency, and so the struggle continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. Okay, our next speaker is Barry Weisleiter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada, the political producer of this series of webcasts, union organizer, chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and co-editor of Socialist Action. So welcome, Barry. You have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. What a wonderful presentation by Cliff. Hard act to follow, but I'm going to try. If revolution is the engine of social change, France was the cauldron of revolution. I'm now going to discuss an important revolutionary development that is of particular interest to the new rising revolutionary class, the world working class. Paris Commune was a radical socialist, anti-religious and revolutionary government that ruled Paris from 18 March to 28 of May in 1871. The Franco-Prussian War had led to the capture of Emperor Napoleon III in September 1870, the collapse of the Second French Empire, and the beginning of the Third Republic. And we know the Franco-Prussian War was about France trying to reassert its dominant position in Europe, and Bismarck's effort to crush France and establish the unity of the states that went on to form Germany. Because Paris was under siege for 4 months, the Third Republic moved its capital to Tours. A hotbed of working class radicalism, Paris was primarily defended during this time by the radical troops of the National Guard rather than regular army troops. Paris surrendered to the Prussians on the 28th January 1871, and in February, Adolphe Thiers, the new chief executive of the French national government, signed an armistice with Prussia that disarmed the army but not the National Guard. On the 18th of March, soldiers of the Commune's National Guard killed 2 French army generals, and the Commune refused to accept the authority of the French government. The Commune governed Paris for 2 months until it was suppressed by the regular French army during La Semaine Sanglante, the Bloody Week, beginning on the 21st of May, 1871. The French army, with the support of German forces, slaughtered 20,000 communards. Tens of thousands more were imprisoned or deported. The policies and outcome of the Commune had a significant influence on the ideas of Karl Marx, who described it as the first example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Marx, in the Civil War in France, 1871, written during the Commune, praised the Commune's achievements. He described it as the prototype for a revolutionary government of the future. Quote, the form at last discovered for the emancipation of the proletariat. Marx wrote that, quote, working men's Paris with its Commune will be forever celebrated as the glorious harbinger of a new society. Its martyrs were enshrined in the great heart of the working class. Its exterminators, history has already nailed to the eternal pillory from which all of the prayers of their priests will not avail to redeem them, close quote. Engels echoed his partner, maintaining that the absence of a standing army, the self-policing of the quarters, isn't that relevant to today's discussion about disarming and defunding the police, and other features meant that the Commune was no longer a state in the old repressive sense of the term. It was a transitional form, moving towards the abolition of the state as such. He used the famous term later taken up by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. The Commune was, he said, the first dictatorship of the proletariat, a state run by workers and in the interests of workers. But Marx and Engels were not entirely uncritical of the Commune. The split between the Marxists and anarchists at the 1872 Hague Congress of the First International may in part be traced to Marx's stance that the Commune might have saved itself had it dealt more harshly with the reactionaries, instituted conscription, and centralized decision-making in the hands of a revolutionary authority. The other point of disagreement was the anarchist opposition to the communist conception of the conquest of power and of a temporary transitional state. The anarchists were in favor of general strike and immediate dismantlement of the state through the constitution of decentralized workers' councils as those seen in the Commune. But how to combat the highly centralized and ferocious assault on the workers' councils by the ruling rich? Lenin, like Marx, considered the Commune a living example of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but he criticized the communards for not having done enough to secure their position, highlighting two errors in particular. The first was that the communards, quote, stopped halfway, led astray by dreams of establishing a higher capitalist justice in the country. Such institutions as the banks, for example, were not taken over. Secondly, he thought their, quote, excessive magnanimity had prevented them from destroying the class enemy. For Lenin, the communards, quote, underestimated the significance of direct military operations in civil war, and instead of launching a resolute offensive against Versailles, where the reactionaries were headquartered, that would have crowned its victory in Paris, it tarried and gave the Versailles government time to gather the dark forces and prepare for the blood-soaked week of May, close quote. In the last preface to the new German edition of the Communist Manifesto dated June 24th, 1872, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels say that the program of the Communist Manifesto, and I quote, has in some details become out of date. And they go on to say, quote, one thing especially was proved by the Commune, namely that the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. Lenin notes that this passage comes from Marx's book, The Civil War in France. Lenin writes, quote, a vulgar interpretation of Marx's famous statement just quoted is that Marx allegedly emphasized the idea of slow development in contradistinction to the seizure of power. As a matter of fact, Lenin writes, the exact opposite is the case. Marx's idea is that the working class must break up, must smash the ready-made state machinery and not confine itself merely to laying hold of it. The Commune, therefore, appears to have replaced the smashed state machine only by fuller democracy, abolition of the standing army, all officials to be elected and subject to recall. But as a matter of fact, this only signifies a gigantic replacement of certain institutions by other institutions of a fundamentally different type. This is exactly the case of quantity being transformed into quality. Democracy, introduced as fully and consistently as as it was conceivable, is transformed from bourgeois into proletarian democracy, from the state that is a special force for the suppression of a particular class into something which is no longer the state proper. It is still necessary to suppress the bourgeoisie and crush their resistance. This was particularly necessary for the Commune, and one of the reasons for its defeat was that it did not do so with sufficient determination. The organ of suppression, however, is here the majority of the population, and not a minority, as was always the case under slavery, serfdom, and wage slavery. And since the majority of the people itself suppresses its oppressors, special force for suppression is no longer necessary. In this sense, the state begins to wither away. Instead of the special institutions of a privileged minority, privileged officialdom, the chiefs of the standing army, the majority itself can directly fulfill all of these functions, and the more the functions of state power are performed by the people as a whole, the less there is need for the existence of this power. Close quote. And that's from Lenin's famous work, The State and Revolution, written in 1917. So, in summary, what is the significance of the Paris Commune today, almost 150 years later? Firstly, the capitalist state cannot be reformed out of existence. It must be smashed and replaced by a worker state, leading to a worldwide socialist revolution. Revolution in one country alone is not possible. The failure of the reformist parliamentary road to socialism is demonstrated by events in Spain in 1936, Indonesia in 1965, Chile in 1973, Bolivia in 1964, and again in 2019, and by many, many other bitter examples. Secondly, there are profound lessons for workers' democracy that apply today. Representatives in government should be paid a salary equal to the average salary of the people they represent. We simply don't need the best politicians that money can buy. The same applies to union officials. Their pay should be roughly equal to that of the workers that they represent. In other words, the pay of union and NDP bureaucrats and of politicians generally should be cut. SA members who are elected to public office pledge to live on an average worker's salary and devote the rest to socialist organizing. Representatives on public bodies should be subject to immediate recall by their constituents. That is what accountability means. All points of view within the framework of the worker state and within the revolutionary constitution should enjoy freedom of speech, freedom of association, and have full and equal access to the platform of the mass media. We demand proportional representation for parties and for tendencies within parties. Workers' democracy is not a luxury, it is a necessity. We in Socialist Action honor the principles of the Paris Commune for reasons that you can see. We strive to implement them in our unions, mass labor parties, social justice movements, and all across society. And if you agree with that, well, you should join Socialist Action. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Okay, so now we're going to go to our producer, Kurt Young, and find out if there are any questions. And then the questions will be put in the chat line, I think, or comrades will copy them down. And we will take 3 questions, if we have 3 questions. And then we will go back to our speakers. We will start with Barry and then go to Cliff. And you will be given up to 6 minutes each to answer. You can answer all questions or just one. It's up to you. Okay, so, okay, Kurt, go ahead.
All right, so we have several questions, and our first question is coming from our host, Elizabeth Weiss, and it is, if Marat was not assassinated, would the outcome of the revolution be different? And I will repost that in the chat there so you can see it. And the next one is from Ellen Ramsey, and she asks, what were the positions of the revolutionaries to slavery? And our final question for this round is from Alex Badila, and he asks, what lessons can we learn from the French Revolution and the Paris Commune of 1871 when it comes to revolution in the modern day?
Okay, so I'm going to start with Barry and then go to Cliff, and you have 6 minutes each.
Well, terrific questions. I look forward to those that will come further on. If Marat was not assassinated, what would have been the outcome of the French Revolution? As a historical materialist, I have to take the view that it would be roughly the same. We don't have a great man theory of history. The French Revolution exhausted its possibilities as a capitalist revolution. The working class was not yet strong enough to impose a new mode of production, a new way for society to operate in the economy or in political life. I have the highest regard for Marat, and I want to say that Cliff's book on Jean-Paul Marat is remarkable. Not only is it a great summary of the course of the French Revolution, but of the complex character, Marat, and the self-sacrificing individual. He was the person who really originated the idea of wall posters that conveyed a message, not just an image. And his writings were transformed, were printed in poster form and posted all over the city, so he could communicate at least with those who were able to read, who would then read it aloud to those who. So Marat was an extraordinary individual. I would say, all proportions guarded, he was like the Lenin of the French Revolution, but without the Bolshevik Party, without any party that was disciplined, that would carry out his vision. So if he hadn't been assassinated, the revolutionary democracy might have been more vibrant and lasted a bit longer, but it couldn't overcome the historical limitations of society at that point. The bourgeois revolution ran its course. The revolution and slavery. Well, of course, the French Revolution stood for liberty, fraternity, and equality. So slavery had no place in French society, but there was still slavery on the fringes, and of course in the colonies. And the French colony of Haiti was perhaps the wealthiest colony in the world, and the French Revolution didn't bring an end to slavery there. Only the Haitian Revolution did, and that's a subject of another talk. But Toussaint, the leader of the Haitian Revolution, unfortunately, when he negotiated a conclusion of the insurrection, he was conveyed to France and died in prison there. That kind of tells you where the French Revolution stood on the exploitation of the colonies and slaves. Lessons for the modern day. Well, I tried to summarize some of the key lessons in terms of the Paris Commune and the French Revolution. And I guess the most important are that, first of all, the state cannot be reformed out of existence. It must be smashed, and a new state born to serve the interests of the majority class in terms of this epoch. Secondly, there are profound lessons for workers' democracy in the Paris Commune, I guess to a lesser extent in the French Revolution, although the seeds of some of these ideas in the radical Jacobins is relevant, and that is that representatives in public office should be paid no more than the people that they are mandated to represent, that there should be the right to recall elected officials, to hold them accountable to their constituents, and of course full access to the printing presses in that day, today's media, so that there can be a free flow of ideas, freedom of association, freedom of expression is really, really crucial. But in the throes of revolution, it's important to defend the revolution and its gains, and not to allow the right wing to use so-called freedom of speech in order to raise up arms against the interests of the majority. So there's a tension there. But it's very important in the revolutionary camp, in the workers' movement today in our day, to uphold greater union democracy, greater democracy in civil society, the united front principle, and unity in action in order to conquer all the ills of present society.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Cliff? You're still muted, Cliff.
Cliff, there's
Is that okay? You got me now?
Yes, good.
All right. I didn't realize I'd been muted. Sorry. Okay, I've got 6 minutes, so I think I can put 2 minutes on each one of those three questions. Marat's assassination, if he'd lived, would the outcome of the revolution been different? I agree completely with Barry on the general principle of historical materialism. probably wouldn't have made any difference, even if he'd come back strong, because at that point, when he was assassinated, his assassin probably did him a favor to get him off the stage of history quickly, because he was very, very sick, and physically he was done. So his assassination did have an immediate political effect, because the woman who did it, Charlotte Corday, was a partisan of the Girondin faction, and by murdering him, she pulled. There was a tremendous wave of anger against the Girondins. They were all arrested. They were the leaders were executed, or guillotined. So by killing Marat, she sealed the fate of her own party. Anyway, next question was about slavery and the Haitian Revolution. Well, obviously the Haitian Revolution, I mean the French Revolution, had something to say about slavery, as Barry pointed out, through their colonial possessions, and especially in Haiti. Inspired by the events in France, a number of Haitian-born revolutionary movements emerged simultaneously, and they used as their inspiration the French Revolution's declarations of the rights of man, which I talked about. Marat himself, well, you know, the bourgeois revolutionaries were not so interested in ending slavery, but the 93ers were. And then when they were replaced, and eventually by Bonaparte, Napoleon Bonaparte sent an army to Haiti to try to maintain colonial rule there by military force. But his army was defeated by the rebellion, by the slave rebellion, and Haiti declared its independence in 1804. So anyway, I'll just read you what Marat said about the slavery in Haiti. He was responding to some the white colonial the white people of Haiti had declared independence, and he said, "Well, okay, but you know, he wasn't for colonial possessions in any sense." But he said, if the whites of Haiti had the right to proclaim independence, then the other people in Haiti, the blacks, had the same, like all, I'm quoting now, like all human beings had the right to resist oppression. The whites had made themselves despotic masters of the mulattoes and tyrannical masters of the blacks, and if the latter wished to overthrow the cruel and shameful yoke under which they suffer, they are authorized to use any means available, even massacring their oppressors to the last. So that's what the most radical voice of the French Revolution had to say about slavery. I don't know how much time I have left, but somebody asked, what are the lessons of the French Revolution history today for people who are working for social change? Lessons from history are never specific, but there are general lessons. Many historians will try to tell you that there are no lessons in history. Those are the conservative historians. But I tend to agree with Karl Marx's general idea that philosophers have heretofore only interpreted the world, and the point is to change it. And if you apply that to history, the same thing happens. We can interpret what happened in the past, but we must also use that as lessons to change it. A couple of general things that you can see from the presentation I made tonight is the fact that nothing ever really changes without the driving force of mass action in the streets. It was those Parisian insurrections that I listed the dates of that drove the revolution and big jumps of change. The other thing, Barry mentioned that he thought Marat was somewhat like Lenin, except he didn't have a party. That's true. That's why I consider Robespierre to be the most important of the French revolutionaries, and Marat I say is number 2. Marat didn't have a party, but Robespierre did. And,
1 minute.
Okay. And that's what made Robespierre's leadership more important. He had a party. the need for political leadership can also be seen in the French Revolution. I don't have time to go into that in detail, but Barry mentioned my biography of Marat. And in that book, I tried to define what it was about Marat and about Robespierre that was revolutionary leadership that was necessary to make the gains that the French Revolution did.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. We're going to go back to Kurt, our producer now. I think we have 2 or 3 questions left. I think Kurt has a question as well. So we'll take 3 more questions and come back to our speakers again. And this time, Cliff will start, and then Barry, and you'll have, again, each 6 minutes to answer. Go ahead, Kurt.
All right, so our first question comes from Roy Jones. He asks, the ruling class amends its action based on previous revolutions. We have to learn from the French Revolution and amend our program for the current objective situation. What do we now know? And then my question is, I do know that you guys have spoken to the Haitian Revolution, but could you please elaborate further on the connections between the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution? Those are our questions.
Okay, so there's 2, so you have up to 7 minutes in each to talk on that, or if you've left something out you want to say on the other questions. So we'll start with Cliff and then Barry.
Okay, I think I'll be rather brief this time, just to continue on the Haitian Revolution. If people are aware of how the revolution, it was like the French Revolution, where we said that there were 4 waves crashing against the monarchy. In Haiti, there were several waves crashing against the colonial rulers. First with the slaves themselves, and then the white colonists also had a rebellion going on the side, which is what Marat was answering. But the bottom line of the whole thing is that slaves initiated the rebellion in 1791. 12 years later, they'd succeeded in ending not just slavery, but French control over the colony, in spite of the fact that the army of Napoleon Bonaparte was sent to Haiti to crush the revolution, and it wasn't able to. I wasn't quite sure about the other question, about the ruling class learning from past revolutions. That's certainly true. And I'm sorry to say that it seems that the ruling classes learn a lot more from revolutions than a new generation of revolutionaries learn. And that's why I think we need to study more the details of how people like Marat, people like Robespierre, Lenin, people of the Paris Commune of 1871 developed their leadership and were able to see through the tricks that were being played on them. Frankly, I think that the ruling class today has tremendous technological advantages, and my revolutionary optimism is that despite that, it's not going to save them in the end, because the incredibly, the immense economic inequality in the world today is unsustainable. It cannot last one way or another, no matter how much technological weaponry the ruling class has at its disposal. It cannot stand. So that's my revolutionary optimism.
Okay, thank you, Cliff. Barry, you have up to 7 minutes.
Yeah. Well, Roy Jones asks, how would we amend our program for today? I don't think we would radically amend it, but I think we could reinforce it in some particular ways. And I touched on some of those a few moments ago. So I suppose it bears some repetition and reinforcement. One, we need to have very clear, and this should be reflected in our program and orientation. This should be reflected in our program and orientation that in terms of the state, all of history teaches us. The French Revolution did, the Paris Commune certainly did, and the events in the 20th century and the 21st century that I mentioned, right up to the coup that overthrew the radical nationalist government in Bolivia, that the ruling class, the privileged elite that dominates society economically and politically, will not stand aside. No matter how the will of the majority is expressed clearly, unmistakably, in obvious terms, the ruling class will not abide by it. We have a taste of this. Maybe it's just a small taste of it. It may not come to fruition, let us hope, when Trump says he won't honor the results of the American presidential election if he loses. Well, the Democrats don't pose a threat to American capitalism. In fact, the capitalists prefer the Democrats. More billionaires support Biden than Trump, although there are billionaires on both sides. But if they feel threatened, they will not stand aside, and they will mow down all of their, constitutional provisions that purportedly stand for the interests of the majority. They'll be cast aside. Trudeau the Elder instituted the War Measures Act to intimidate and try to destroy the Quebec movement for self-determination with the invocation of the act in 1970, and there have been other instances before and since where it has been deployed. So we need to be aware of the class nature of the state, and the mass movement should organize mass peaceful demonstrations in the streets to assert its demands, but it has to be prepared to defend itself against the organs of repression, which are used by the privileged elite to ensure the perpetuation of their system. The party. Leadership is crucial. It was crucial in the French Revolution, and you see the cascade from one set of leaders representing the interests of one class to another set, to another set, to another set, as they exhausted their possibilities. There's a logical sequence of events, regardless the particular personalities who made it up. Leadership is crucial today as well, and we need to say without apology that the working class cannot win unless there's a workers' agenda, a working class leadership that fights for a workers' government, that the working class represents the vast majority of the population, and by alliance with other sectors of the population, it can realize the dreams and aspirations and the rights and hopes and benefits of the vast majority and can save the world from eco-catastrophe. That leadership is crucial, and a particular kind of party is necessary, one that Marat didn't envision, but one that Lenin and Trotsky did. We need such a revolutionary party in order to fight the ideological battle for a program that will transform present society into a qualitatively better one. Class is the decisive factor. That's another thing to reinforce in our program that Roy asked us to comment. Class is the decisive factor that informs, in the case of Socialist Action, the party I lead, our orientation to the mass working class bodies, to the trade unions, to the cooperative movement, to the tenants' rights organizations, to the party of the trade unions, the NDP, and other mass organizations. Class is decisive. There are many important social movements which are of a non-specific class composition or orientation. They can realize their aims only by winning the majority of the working class, and that requires unity in action, common fronts,
1 minute.
joint electoral efforts, in order to fashion a majority that can not only win the issue for which they are struggling, but to transform society by bringing the mass of working people to a comprehensive program that stands for social transformation. That is important, and class must be situated at the front of it as a criterion for political demands. And finally, workers' democracy. Cliff made a very important point that the terror was necessary in order to defend the security of France, but that was drawing attacks from imperial Europe. But it's also important to understand that weapons of repression can be used against those who wield them in the first instance. So it's important for the revolutionaries to be firm and clear in their objectives and not to waver, but also to, if anything, to err on the side of inclusion and generosity of spirit, because that will inspire people and reduce the need for violence in the transition of society from class to classless, liberated humanity.
Okay, thank you, Barry. So we've had 2 late questions come in, and we want to be inclusive to all of our audience. So Kurt will put them in the chat now and read them. Kurt?
All right, our first question comes from Corey David. What do you think of the current level of struggle in France, the Yellow Vest movement, and the actions like the ZAD airport, construction site occupation, refugees struggling for rights? And our second question comes from Hepsi KS. Given the necessity of street protests, what hat do you think are the factors that may limit widespread street protests in the present, in addition to the impact of the coronavirus?
Okay, comrades, these are big questions, but we only have 4 minutes each to answer them because we're going to be running out of time. So I will go to Cliff first and then to Barry. You have 4 minutes to do your best with these 2 questions.
Cliff, you are currently muted.
Yes.
I'm back, right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I won't need 4 minutes because I don't have that much to say on these questions. The Yellow Vests, I've read news articles about them, but I haven't had personal contact there or anything like that. What little personal contact I have had has been from people who are quite enthusiastic about the movement, but have to admit that it's a very varied sort of grouping of people with all kinds of different people in it, some quite reactionary. So that's about all I can say about that. And I'm sorry to say I didn't catch the second question. I had something to do with coronavirus, but I didn't.
It's in the chat. Can you see it in the chat?
Unfortunately, I can't because there's something in the, well, I won't go into the technicality.
Well, anyway, if you listen, the question is this. Given the necessity of street protests, what do you think are the factors that may limit widespread street protests in the present, in addition to the impact of the coronavirus?
Well, the coronavirus itself is a limiting factor, obviously, but I don't think that's kept people out of the streets, as we've seen over the last several months here in the United States and in other parts of the world as well. The other main factor is the threat of repression, and the idea that Trump is floating that he can just call out the military and override any local restraints or anything like that. I don't think that will stop people either, although it will have an impact. It will limit the size of crowds if the threatened repression is direct enough, obviously. So I don't see anything except for the coronavirus effect where people are afraid to come out in big crowds. As I say, it hasn't stopped very many people yet, apparently. But I think otherwise it's going to be business as usual, and street demonstrations will continue and hopefully be triumphant.
Thank you, Cliff. Okay, Barry, 4 minutes.
Thanks for those questions. Without a doubt, COVID-19 is a sobering and disturbing factor that impacts on mass political protest. We need to wage protest as best we can in the circumstances. We need to ensure that demonstrations that we organize or in which we participate are, to the extent possible, characterized by physical distancing, the wearing of personal protective equipment, particularly masks and gloves. We do in Socialist Action practice these precautions, and the demonstrations in which we've participated have generally followed these rules. Demonstrations are occurring. In fact, some of the biggest demonstrations that have happened in decades have occurred since the pandemic took hold in March, particularly demonstrations against racism and police brutality. So this is encouraging. This shows that humanity is indomitable, that is irrepressible, that people will take risks in order to assert their rights and to fight back against a massively unjust system. And I honor and respect those who are resilient and who fight back. And we want to do this with as much prudence as possible in order to protect the vanguard of the fighters for the needs of the vast majority of the population. But we cannot put our struggles into hibernation. We have to fight back as best we can. And I've heard some people say, well, everyone's at home, working at home, and you can't really wage collective struggles as we could in the pre-pandemic period. Well, that's an exaggeration. There are some giant corporations that are profiting enormously from the pandemic. And I'm thinking of the retail trade in particular, corporations, like Walmart and Amazon, where workers are paid abysmally low wages, and they're on the front ranks. They're called heroes. They were given a $2 an hour increase for a couple of months in the summer, and then it was heartlessly removed from them. There should be walkouts and strikes in the retail sector, particularly hitting the corporations that have profited directly from the misery of the vast majority of the population. And don't get me started on the long-term care centers, where profits have been put before workers and the elderly residents of the nursing homes by for-profit corporations. They should be expropriated, and those who ran those corporations and the governments that deregulated the sector and allowed the mayhem and deaths to occur at alarming rates should be charged, and if convicted, jailed for their misconduct, for their irresponsible behavior. So there's scope for struggle. Workers who are employed
1 minute, Barry.
Workers who are employed at hotels on a subcontract basis and then dismissed and not paid, owed millions of dollars by their employers, and replaced by other workers paid equally miserable wages. That is unacceptable. And those workers in the hotel sector and other profitable sectors should walk out with our support. And this is the basis for the next revolution. The current level of France, I will encourage people to read the publications of the French Trotskyist movement. I'm not going to try to summarize them other than to agree with Cliff, that les gilets jaunes, the yellow jackets, were a multifaceted movement, but they helped to defeat Macron's aim to destroy labor rights and pension rights, and I take my hat off to them for doing that. And one final point about war. I referred to 1871, the Paris Commune. That was in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, and that war was so much like the wars that still pervade the world. One state trying to reassert its position in Europe, another trying to consolidate and unify its brethren ruling class states. A war of plunder where the workers lost on both sides. These wars of intervention, these wars of imperialism, these wars of interstate rivalry by bourgeois governments must be opposed. And the answer is the construction of a massive anti-war movement and a revolutionary party to lead us away from the system of war and plunder and to save the world from ecological catastrophe. That's the music of the future, and I hear it more and more loudly playing in the streets of North America and around the world.
Your time's up, Barry.
Join us and we'll make that music the rhapsody of the future socialist revolution.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back. We have a wee bit of time left and give each speaker 1 minute if they want to say something to wrap up. Cliff? You're muted. You're muted.
I did forget something in answer to the last question about what the problems are with the problem in the United States.
Your mic is causing a whole lot of noise.
Keep your mic off your shirt.
You're muted, Cliff.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, just very quickly. We have a problem in the United States that you don't have in Canada, and that is we have large numbers of armed right-wingers that are being encouraged by police departments and by the executive power of the United States to come into the streets and shoot demonstrators dead. And we're going to have to confront that, but that is a factor that has to be taken into consideration. That's all I have to say. I just wanted to say goodbye and thank you to Kurt, Barry, and Elizabeth for inviting me to speak tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Barry, you have a minute if you want to wrap up.
I want to thank Cliff for his presentation tonight and his wonderful books. The People's History of Science is something that every working person should read, and I just can't wait to read his latest book on the abuses of science from right up to Trump, from Truman. Very much looking forward to it. We have the possibility of transforming the world if we learn the lessons of history, the lessons that were emphasized in tonight's presentations and discussions. Thanks to everyone for their questions. Let's work together to bring about a world socialist revolution.
Okay, so special thanks to Cliff, to Barry, and of course, to Kurt, our producer, who's in Mississauga, and everyone who participated in tonight's conversation. So please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspaper. It's only $25 for 1 year and it's delivered to your door. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. So once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next webcast is on Thursday, October the 15th at 7 p.m. and it's for tuition-free post-secondary education with Kayla Wheeler, Ontario rep for the Canadian Federation of Students, plus Samantha Richards in Hamilton and Dick Fast in Toronto. So for the details, just visit www.socialistaction.ca. In the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now.